We now are going to have, I think, a very, very fascinating panel. Up next, I'm going to invite for a deep dive on the complex relationship between social media and journalism and its impact on trust in news. We've got Wesley Lowery, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. Love his work. Femi Oke, host of The Stream on Al Jazeera English. She's phenomenal. And Gerald Seib, former Washington executive editor of the Wall Street Journal. And our moderator for this session is my star colleague, Gina Chua, Semafor's founding executive editor. Gina, over to you.
So, thanks all of you for coming. Really quick lightning round, 2 minutes each. So, journalistic objectivity. What is it? Does it matter? And frankly, do readers actually care? Jerry, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks.
You're the hot spot.
Well, first, thanks for doing this. I'm glad to be here. It's an important topic. First, I'll start by saying what I don't think objectivity is, what it's not. It's not an absence of personal views or thoughts or opinions or feelings. Everybody's got those. We should admit that. I think objectivity in the journalistic context is the ability to set those aside as a professional and approach whatever you're reporting on and writing about in an objective fashion, in a fair fashion, as an impartial observer. And it doesn't mean you can't have voice. It doesn't mean you can't be analytical. You need to have voice and you need to be analytical, but you also have to be, to use a sports metaphor, the tough umpire on the playing field who's willing to call out any and all sides.
Gary?
What you're trained to do either at your first media organization or at journalism school that is the standard you should aim for. And then 30 years later, you realize that this is not possible. All of us have biases, and that maybe true objectivity is, what does your newsroom look like? How diverse is it? Who are the people sharing the stories, doing the communication? It's much more complex than I can be an impartial person. That is impossible.
Well, I think that that's an important part of this, right? There's no such thing as an impartial observer. We're setting a standard that literally does not exist. We're beginning our relationship with our reader with a lie. It is impossible for any of us through any process to make ourselves impartial. What we can do is we can vow to be fair, we can vow to do journalism that has rigor, we can vow to seek and collect all of the relevant information. But I think that we have to be, I think one of the things that's important when we look at the idea of journalistic objectivity is we go back to Lippmann, who does the writing critiquing the New York Times and its coverage of the Russian Revolution. And he concludes that too much of the journalism is, he writes, the world as the editors and writers wished it would be as opposed to the world as it actually is. And he writes that the journalism is too reliant on government sources and government narratives, often anonymously, that it reflects the biases and the wills and the hopes of the powerful people running organizations like the New York Times, which historically has been conservative to moderate white people. That remains true today. I love you, Ben and Justin, wherever you are, right? But what he argues for is in order to overcome that, we need to create a process of objectivity that can be replicated, that it doesn't matter who the reporter is to some extent, because if you follow this process, it can be replicated. What we've seen happen over the 100 years since Lippmann is journalism that has all the exact same problems. We get into a war in Iraq because no one can bother to check what the government says about whether weapons of mass destruction. We lie to our readers for a week about what happened in Uvalde because no one bothers to check what the police said happened. We say that George Floyd had a medical incident on the street corner because no one could be bothered to go to the street corner and interview anybody. The exact same problems Lippmann laid out, and yet we've created an obsession with personal objectivity, a thing that does not exist. And so we all perform. Well, I won't even vote because I don't have any opinions. Well, that's nonsense, right? We've created a PR apparatus instead of doing journalism the way we were supposed to be doing journalism in the first place.
We didn't answer, do audiences care?
Yes, do audiences care?
Yes, they do care. They will tell you, listen to readers. They will tell you that they care. And I think, look, my concern, and I understand the point you're making, my concern is that if you say objectivity is not possible, you're essentially admitting defeat. And I think there's great peril down the road for that, for our profession, because you guarantee polarization and balkanization, not in society, but in what we do that contributes to the balkanization. And
but I'm not saying you have to pick a side. Far from it.
I'm not either.
But just be very aware of your own biases and prejudices. And sometimes you don't even know what they are.
Well, what I would say is we're admitting defeat at an unconquerable task. Yes, it is impossible for any of us individually to be objective. Let's admit that defeat.
Why
not?
Let me take both sides of this for a second. Hold on, Wes. So, Jerry, do you really think that people don't know what reporters think? It's fairly clear in their writing. I mean, even if they got off social media, you kind of understand where most reporters are. And doesn't that fairly much?
Do you? Do you know what?
I can tell on certainly on sort of hot button issues. I can tell.
Even on straight news coverage. When I read the local newspaper, I can, as a black person, I can tell that it wasn't written by someone from my neighborhood.
But that's a different issue. There should
No,
be
it's
more
not.
people
But
from
but
that
it's
neighborhood
not a
writing
different
that
issue.
newspaper,
The
though.
average straight news coverage reflects a set of values and a set of what questions you ask. It's on the wall as we walked in here. If you don't ask the right questions, you don't get any answers, right? And so for any number of people who've been excluded, and communities that have been excluded from mainstream news organizations for as long as they've existed in America, we all read the straight news coverage and we go, yeah, this stuff is dripping with bias, right? We know this. And so, again, what I would suggest, again, is not that we don't pursue fairness, that we don't pursue rigor, but that we stop starting our relationship with our readers by lying to them. The New York Times put out social media guidelines after Roe v. Wade. And what they said in their email was, if our reporters are perceived as biased, people will not trust our journalism. But your reporters are biased. So we're saying, if our readers know the truth, they won't trust our journalism. Not if our journalism is perceived as biased, not if our journalism is perceived as unfair. If our individual reporters are perceived as being human, our readers won't trust us.
Wes, let me take a point of that. So, you tweeted recently about how, being black or being LGBT or being a woman is a sort of political position because it sort of explains where you are and how you see it. And I think there's real merit to that. Where's the line you would draw? If I were to tweet, so-and-so candidate is, the Antichrist and should never take office, should I be allowed to cover that person? How would they expect to get a
Probably not, but I don't know that that's a real issue that ever happens. I mean, yes, sure. I think if you tweet that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, you should probably not be the Donald Trump
Okay, but if you
right, I think we all agree on that. Right?
Or the White House correspondent.
Sure, right, but if the sports reporter tweets that, do I really care? No, not really.
But Femi, you were talking about coverage.
Personal experience is that I do not put my political views on social media ever. I'm asked in articles very often, what do you think about, this happened just last week, we're doing an article, we would like to use a photograph, we're asking all the women what they feel about Roe versus Wade being overturned. I said, literally today I am doing that story. I cannot do that. I am not going to give you my opinion. I'm a journalist. I'm covering this story. So my social media, I police my social media. I hold myself back. I filter out all of my political opinions. Some of them you can probably tell, but I'm deliberately not putting them out there because I feel my responsibility is if I have people who are coming onto my current affairs show, regardless of where they fall politically, I want them to feel comfortable that they can talk to me. They haven't gone through my Twitter, my TikTok, my Instagram and decided, oh, she's a this or she's a that. I'm coming prepared for that. I don't want them to be able to tell from my social what I believe. It's not about me.
If I could go back for a second just to some of the earlier comments from Taylor and John, and to your point, Wes, about sort of the objectivity of process as opposed to the personal objectivity. We're in a world now where I think we all sort of agree that trust is transferring to individuals away from organizations. It's one thing to sort of say the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or Al Jazeera, or the BBC has really rigorous process. And so if you work there, well, just I saw the head nod. If you work there, we trust it or we should trust it because they have that process. How do I know, unless I put in the real effort, that a story that an individual does, and there's so much disaggregated, so much disaggregation from the organization that you work for, how do I know we can trust your process as opposed to the Wall Street Journal's process or the Washington Post process?
Well, anything I'm writing is being published somewhere, right? And so it is the Washington Post process or GQ Magazine's process or the Wall Street Journal's process, right? I'm not publishing it just on the internet, right? But I think that, but again, to go back to an earlier point, I think that it is important to listen to the readers. And I think that what the readers have told us is that they want rigorous and fair journalism. They want to be treated like adults. They want answers to the questions. I think the crisis in trust in America in journalism, much less in all of our institutions, is that our institutions aren't trustworthy. Is that the average piece of content I receive, I go to Facebook right now and click on the first 10 articles that I see in my feed, 8 of them are garbage. They're absolute nonsense. They're aggregation of an aggregation. They're a politically skewed overstatement of something that someone said to someone else, taken out of context. And it's hard because we all get into these rooms, and everyone here does really good journalism, a rigorous, fair, work for places with standards. But we have an issue in our industry where we don't talk about the space between the best of our field and the bulk of our field, that the average consumer is not receiving quality journalism. And that speaks to the news deserts we have, the hollowing out of local media, the erosion of standards across the board, right? I do think there is a call, and there should be a call, for more fair and more rigorous journalism. But that said, I also think our institutions have to acknowledge the fact that their processes and their histories have not always engendered trust across the board. There are massive communities that have never trusted them because they have never been trustworthy to those communities. When I spent almost a decade at the Washington Post, and when I would walk into a community, whether it be in Baltimore or in Ferguson and Chicago and other places, they weren't talking to me because I was from the Washington Post. They didn't even know what that was. They were talking to me because I looked like them, because I spoke their language, because I could interact with them, because they deemed me trustworthy. I was bringing a level of trust and relationship to the employer that the employer didn't have. In the same way that Taylor Lorenz, who was on the stage, she has access to all types of people who no one else in that newsroom has access to because of her reputation, because of her background. But the second thing I want to say is I think it's important for us to echo a point John Harris made up here. It's important for us to think about trust and whether people trust us, but journalism is not a democracy. Our job is to write down things that are true. Ben Smith quipped that half the people in this room want to destroy the Washington Post. Well, I don't give a, I'm not going to swear, my mom might be watching. I don't care what those people think. If you're sitting here and you want to destroy the Washington Post and the New York Times, well then screw you. I'm not changing my journalism to try to appease you, someone who doesn't want and who's not interested in a public square and not interested in fact-paced journalism and reporting, right? We spent so much time in our industry trying to appease lunatics and instead of just telling the truth, which is our job, to collect the facts and write down what the objective truths are that are presented by those facts.
I'll come back to that in a second, but Jerry, you look like you want to say something.
The insanity of social media is that you're attacked constantly by people who haven't even read what they're attacking you about. I mean, that's totally obvious from anybody who's read Twitter or
Read the article. Have you read the article before you
right,
tweet
exactly.
it?
That should be the standard response. Anyway, so that's just there. Those people are not media critics. They're basically people who are looking for reasons to vent, and they're finding it every day. And what we do, but so what? That's not our problem, right? I do think what we can do and what we should do is become more transparent about what we do. You asked about how do you engender trust. I think that there's been too much of what, in my career as a journalist, too much of what we've done has been kind of shrouded in secrecy. It's been done in a dark back room, and then you bring the product forward, and that's supposed to speak for itself, and it should speak for itself. But I think we need to be more transparent about how we do, what our sources are, where our information comes from, what the composition of our newsroom really is and isn't. I think if we're asking for transparency among in the institutions we cover, particularly in the government, we have to practice transparency as well. And as I've thought about this topic over the last few years and tried to think about the question you posed, which is what can we do? I mean, I do think we need to be fair and objective, and yes, I do believe in objectivity and impartial, but we also need to be transparent. And we have not been very transparent in my business during my time, which is 45 years in the business. We're getting better, but we're not there yet.
Can I give you an example of transparency that the BBC did quite recently? Because there was a huge Twitter storm about Boris Johnson being booed as he went into the memorial for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. And then when they replayed it, the audience who were watching the video said they muted the boos. The BBC were trying to make Boris Johnson, R.I.P., seem more popular.
I think I know your view on
than
that
he actually... only in this room. Than he actually is. They muted the boos. And what they had done was they had replayed the video, the anchor had spoken over the top of it, and then the video drops. That's what you naturally do. So people watching, like, we were there, we heard it, we heard it. The BBC did a thread and explained technically what was happening to the general public because they didn't understand. This wasn't boogate. They weren't muting the boos. That's how TV works. And they took time on Twitter to explain that. That's transparency that I haven't seen that level of transparency from the BBC before, but they felt they had to answer their critics, and they did it straight away.
Does transparency make a difference, except really at the margins? If, you know, and to Jerry's point, so let's say we're much more open, we're much more transparent about our process. Do you think we would win back people? And we've seen the numbers on trust. Would we win back people? Would we see the numbers move the other way?
Everything happens at the margins. It really. I mean, you start somewhere, right? And look, I think we need to win back trust, but I also think we're in an environment in which that's difficult right now. You know, we're as much we're an easy target to attack. Part of the problem is I don't think people can distinguish easily in the media environment we live in now between legitimate, serious journalism and frivolous, non-serious journalism, and even lies. We all know this. I think in the long run, I think the kind of journalism that we're all talking about, we may have different terminology, but what we're all talking about will win out in the end, because I think quality will win out in the end. I think truth will win out in the end, and I think people's desire to have journalism they can trust will win in the end. But in the end may take a while, because we're sorting through an environment now in which people can't even distinguish between what we're talking about and what a lot of people think is journalism. And I just think we have to have faith. I think we have to have confidence that what we do will win out in the end, and just keep doing it until that becomes the reality. And maybe I'm being naive, but that's what I think.
The thing I'd add to that, and I want to be clear too, I am pro-transparency on all of this, and I'm pro more complicated transparency. On some of our big investigative projects I worked on at the Post and elsewhere, let's publish the back-end data. Let's let people run the analysis we ran, and if we're wrong, we'll, you know, and that was something that, I mean, now almost a decade ago, which makes me feel old, but it was something that we had to talk about internally. If we publish our data, will the New York Times scoop us on the second? But no, let's be transparent, let's put it all out there. And I think the Post and other places have done a really good job with that, publishing raw documents, publishing, in some cases, transcripts and interview notes, and letting people who want to click through themselves and see if they're, I think that's really important. But I do think it's important for us to acknowledge that all of this conversation is happening. I do think that transparency can be helpful and can be helpful in the margins. But all this is happening in the context of a political and social environment in which we've had one of our two major political parties spend 60 years demonizing the media. And this is asymmetrical, and it's not to say there are not criticisms from the other party, but there is one party where the most consistent ideological plank of their party and of its leadership for 60 years has been do not trust the media. Unquestionably, that has had a massive, so I can launch a big police shooting database and win a Pulitzer Prize on it and be hyper transparent. At the beginning, everyone's mad about it. This is anti-cop, and by the end, the cops are using our numbers because they're the best available numbers. Win every award in journalism, and none of that matters when Tucker Carlson goes on air later that night and goes, Wesley Lowery hates cops, send him death threats. So he wouldn't say that, but that's what would end up happening. You put my face on the thing and say, this guy hates, and millions of people are flooding all my inboxes and all my, right, that we have these powerful propaganda organizations in our country that have the ability to speak to millions of people without any context, without any semblance of fairness, and poison the water system. And so you take something that is rigorous, that's hard-earned, that's fought, where we've done all the things we're supposed to do. But if that's not how Laura Ingraham describes it, or how Ben Shapiro describes it, or how Tucker Carlson describes it, it doesn't matter to half of the country.
So, and let me just take that point, right? And you know, you saw that chart earlier on, and so trust in media among, trust in newspapers among Republicans is at 5%, and with Democrats it's like 35%, which is not great either, right?
Not great, but is right where it was around the Iraq War in 2004. So we can't say that social had anything to do with it.
No, I'm not. I'm simply saying trust in media is low, and
Certainly.
and I spent a lot of time in the Philippines. My partner's Filipino, And 60% of the population there voted for the son of Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator that was ousted 30 years ago. And so, the question really is, you made the point, we're doing rigorous journalism, and if people don't want to listen, essentially it's their problem. Well, it's kind of the problem of the country, right? If 95% of 40% of the population doesn't trust the media, what should we, and I don't mean we individually, I don't mean the Washington Post, I don't mean the Wall Street Journal particularly, although the Wall Street Journal does reach a chunk of those people, at least through the edit page. What should we as an industry be doing? Because can we just sit and write off all those people? I mean, it makes us feel great that we're doing great journalism and a whole bunch of people don't believe us and they're all, not our people, if you like. But isn't the purpose of journalism to try and build bridges, to try and reach communities, to try and speak to others, even if they don't really trust us?
The purpose of journalism is to write down true things.
Not
to
to reach
record the
audiences.
world accurately, right? We're not trying to build community with the Nazis as they march us to the camps and calling Goebbels for comment and see if he'll talk to us on background, right? Like that's
Wasn't
not like
what I meant.
our point is to and tell our Jewish colleagues, stop tweeting about the death camps. Now Hitler's not returning my call on background anymore and complaining to the boss about it, right? The point of journalism is to record true things. And what I will say is, I think that the extent to which this becomes nationalized and politically nationalized, I think harms us. I think, speaking to some of the stuff Jim mentioned earlier, that the Knight Foundation has done, right? I think that we have to rebuild our trust in our communities by having media in many of these communities, re-engaging the public, right? And I think so I think it matters much more if there's a local newspaper in Champaign, Illinois, than it does if the Washington Post calls Donald Trump's racism or not. Now, I think the Washington Post should call Donald Trump's racism. I think it's our job to say true things, right? But I think what's extremely important is the fact that for so many Americans, they no longer have a direct, much less a local or communal relationship with the news and with the institution of news and with the institution of media. I think that's really important. I think beyond that, again, the best thing we can do to earn trust is to be trustworthy, is when we write something down to have it be true, to actually cover all communities the way we say we want to. And again, what I would suggest is that even in the best organizations, we do a much worse job than we're willing to admit. And a lot of our trust is earned, or a lot of the distrust is earned. And I say that as someone from communities who have never been covered well by any of these institutions ever for a single day in the history of America.
All right, Jerry.
Well, I do think oddly, I think the decline of local news is a contributing factor here, and a significant one, because a lot of people live in communities of every type across this country, and we're talking about urban, we're talking about rural, we're talking about flyover country, we're talking about the coast, who don't have any local journalism. They don't have any experience in reading journalism that explains the community in which they live, and so they don't have any sense of trust in a media that doesn't exist for them. So I think that's actually a factor. I just wanted to point out that this mistrust of the media is certainly more prevalent among Republicans, but it's not only among Republicans. Two really good pollsters, Joel Benenson, who was Obama's pollster, and Neil Newhouse, who's a Republican pollster, did a survey for the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago very recently, and they asked an interesting question. They said, when consuming news, do you believe that the people who created the news content, that is the reporters, editors, and newscasters, are trying to present the facts with as little bias as possible, or trying to get their own viewpoint across? 37% of the people surveyed said trying to present facts with little bias. 48% said trying to get their own viewpoints across. Yes, 67% of Republicans, but also 52% of independents and 32% of Democrats said that they are trying to get their own personal viewpoints across. Those are not encouraging numbers, even if there's variation among subgroups. So we have to be aware of this reality, and I think and push back against it, but also I think recognize that we're dealing with some structural problems here that will take time to address. It's not going to be fixed overnight.
Femi, much of this conversation is built around the U.S. It's built around news deserts here, which is a very particular issue. Obviously, there is a sort of a business model crisis around the world. But how much does this play out? How relevant is this discussion, you think, to the rest of the world?
The idea of facts being optional, or if you decide you like them or you may not like them, was happening around the world before it came to the US. So really experienced. And it was just more surprising to see how I often see other regions deal with elections, deal with politicians, being done and then some in the United States. So you're just catching up with the rest of the world. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, we're going to wrap up in a short bit. So I'm just going to do a quick lightning round, which is okay. And I think I've heard the answers so far, but I'd like you to just restate them. So Wes, what can we do? What are we solving? And really quickly, a minute each. Wes, what do we do? What's the one thing we can do to help increase trust?
We can tell the truth and be transparent about our process. We can help rebuild community journalism and be accountable to those communities. And we can recommit ourselves to a level of rigor and fairness. I think one of the, unspoken secrets of most of journalism is that most of us work at publications where the average piece that gets published couldn't make it through the investigative desk editors. It wouldn't be well sourced enough, it wouldn't have been checked. We accept as a premise that there's a massive gulf between the best of our work and the bulk of our work. And I think if we could get more of the bulk of our work to look more like the best of our work, our work would be more trustworthy and therefore it would engender more trust.
Okay, Femi.
Talk to our audiences, not at them, with them. Engage with them, listen to them, which is the hard bit, because you have to filter. And then you're working collaboratively. They don't feel that you are just presenting their story, you are amplifying their stories. I try and do that every day.
Jerry.
I would say three things. Be fair and impartial, but also be seen as fair and impartial, and those are two different things. Secondly, I do think be transparent, as I said earlier. And third, and I would echo you here, I think listen to our viewers and readers. Listen to them. I think we're having a one-way conversation too much. And doesn't mean everything that every reader says is valid and every criticism is worth listening to. Sometimes they're crazy. But we ought to be listening to the people who are our customers, and those are not one another or the people in this room. They're the people who actually consume the news, and listen to them, because I learned over the years, and you sift through the crazy emails, you realize there's some wisdom in some of them,
Can I
and
ask
you
you a
should
really
just listen.
quick question, Jerry? That kind of setup, right, where we're seeking a level of objectivity or impartiality, whatever word we want to use, and I think we agree broadly on this, right? Adding to that a level of the perception of objectivity, which we accept are two different things, and then also trying to be transparent. Hasn't that largely been the working model of journalism for the last however many decades that has gotten us to this point? Like, what would you say to the argument that that's what we've been doing? That's what the New York Times does, or Reuters does, or the Wall Street Journal. Like, that regime of editors who say this is what you're supposed to do have run American journalism for the last century.
You have 30 seconds.
And now no one trusts it.
For the last century. That was the aspiration. I would say we failed. Or fell short. I wouldn't say failed. And certainly on the transparency thing, as I said earlier, we completely fell short. I mean, we weren't even attempting to be transparent for a long time as a profession. So I think those are still the right aspirational goals. Have we achieved them 100%? No, or we probably wouldn't be in the position we're in. Fair point.
But good, we've solved everything.
It's fixed.
And everyone has taken notes, and so we know what the solutions are. Thank you very much for coming up on stage.
We're going to keep these kinds of conversations going. Big thanks to Wesley Lowery, Femi Oke, Gerald Seib, and my colleague Gina Chua. Thank you all so much.